And then who are you?
I'm Jaimi Butler. I run Great Salt Lake Institute at Westminster College.
Okay. And so I'm here just to discuss the Great Salt Lake. I was out there a few days ago, out by the salt air. And it was pretty astounding to see how far it receded. Is it as bad as it appears to, like, someone who's not studied the Salt Lake?
Yeah, and you know, a lot of people I talk to say, don't you remember in the 80s when water levels were really high and now they're really low? Isn't this just part of like a cyclical part of Great Salt Lake? Because really the shorelines are determined by how much water goes in through precipitation and through the river systems and all through the watershed, and then how much leaves through evaporation. That's the only way water leaves Great Salt Lake is through evaporation. And so people say, well, isn't this part of the cycle? And there's been a lot of research by people up at USU who have recreated precipitation patterns over the past 150 years. And what they assert is that because of the water that we've taken out of the Bear River and out of the Jordan River that we've diverted for agriculture and other human uses, we've shrunk the lake by 40% on average. So, I mean, almost in half is like what the lake is just because of diversions of water, and that doesn't take into account climate change. So we haven't really seen decreased precipitation. We've seen increased temperatures, which would increase evaporation rates, but we have seen the same average precipitation over that 150 years.
Yeah. So if we don't do anything, if we continue just as we're going along now with the agriculture that we're doing and then add climate change to that, how is that going to make things in another 150 years?
Well, it's going to exacerbate it, right? It's just going to like take more water out of the system. And really, I mean, a lot of people are worried not just about maintaining the status quo and what's going on right now, but there's lots of proposals for other water diversions that would also exaggerate the issue and shrink Great Salt Lake. And there's a lot of historical references where we've had experiences drying up salt lakes in different parts of the world that we can go and look at. One of the closest ones is the Owens Lake. And you know, it was a big environmental catastrophe. They took all of the water out, they diverted all of the water from going into Owens Lake and took it into the city of LA. And now the lake bed is dry, it causes extreme dust storms, and they've had to remediate the problem by covering the entire lake bed with rocks, and it's cost more than $2 billion, and 15% of everybody's water bill in the city of LA goes to remediation. And just remember, Owens Lake is 110 square miles. Great Salt Lake is 1,700 square miles.
Yeah. So I guess my follow-up question with that would be, so the impact of losing the Great Salt Lake, like a lot of people, and this is something that I've noticed with climate change, a lot of people struggle with the personalizing the concept, like seeing how, well, climate change is this abstract thing that might affect people 100 years down the road or 200 years down the road. Like, that's not my problem today, and even if it was my problem today, there's not anything I can do about it. What would be the impact of losing a more significant portion of the Great Salt Lake on Utahns, on people who live here?
Well, I'll start with the birds. I mean, this is like a hub of bird activity in the western United States. And so over 10 million birds come here every year for the resources that the lake and the surrounding environments provided. And so we would lose a lot of that. And not only would the birds not come here, but huge populations, like I'll use the example of eared grebes. Over 90% of eared grebe populations come to Great Salt Lake at some point in their life, like the entire world's population. And so we wouldn't just lose grebes here, we would lose grebes all around the world. And so we would lose that recreational opportunity and just that habitat for birds and the other animals that rely on those birds. for people directly, we would be extremely affected. There's going to be dust storms. Our air quality is already not the best in the world. In fact, it's often the worst in the world. So dust that comes off of these lake beds can be very toxic and very dangerous for humans and cause lots of human health effects. So we would have dust storms. The lake provides for lake effect storms. So there's this lake effect that happens because of the interaction of the lake and the air currents and all sorts of different things. But and even though maybe that's 5 to 12% of the snowpack in parts of our mountains, it's not a huge, it's not all lake effect snow.
Yeah.
It's not a huge part, but even losing 5 to 12% of our snowpack is pretty big. So not just losing snowpack, but you remember there's dust coming off the lake bed, and that dust coming off the lake bed will cover the snow and will also melt that snow quicker as there's kind of a darker color on it. Great Salt Lake provides lots of jobs. So in 2012 they did an economic study of Great Salt Lake, and the lake and ecosystem services provide $1.3 billion annually to the state of Utah. So, I mean, there's economic, there's health effects, there's effects to our human ecosystem.
Yeah.
Lots.
Yeah. So if you mentioned earlier about, and first off, I want to comment that if I told my skiing buddies that they were losing 5 to 10% of their snow, they'd be brokenhearted.
I know.
Or 5 to 15%. But where was I going? So you talked earlier about the effects of climate change on Utah's precipitation. Just briefly, what is the impact model saying that we're going to get less precipitation or more?
I wish I knew about projections.
Okay.
I don't know. I know we're definitely expected to have lots of mega droughts, and we're seeing lots of fires, and we're seeing trends around the world are saying there are going to be issues.
Yeah.
And I think too, you need to think about timing of precipitation.
Yeah.
So our whole world here is adapted to having snow that falls in the mountains, and then in the springtime it melts off and it seeps into the wetlands and it regenerates our lakes, and probably that's going to change. I know that our snow lines are expected to increase in elevation, which is a bummer. Our ski mountains are going to be, we're going to have rain on our ski mountains at the lodges.
Yeah, and that's one of the things we talk about in class is the compacting cycles. So negative, or what is it, downward spirals. I'm trying to remember exactly the term, but I can't.
Or negative feedback.
Negative feedback cycles. So,
Yeah.
If you were to guess, would Utah go into a negative feedback cycle, or would that just be?
It can. It really depends on the situation with how lake effect snow works.
Yeah. If there were any suggestions you were to give to policymakers in Utah to try and preserve the Great Salt Lake, what would that be?
Okay, so if I were to give recommendations to policymakers, right now we're really thinking about water in Great Salt Lake, because the lake is fairly resilient. It's used to getting lots of inputs in salt and minerals, and it's adapted to that. And it's a highly manipulated system. So we take salt out of it, we take brine shrimp out of it, salt goes into it. It is kind of a wild urban environment. And so really what's going to imperil Great Salt Lake is not getting enough water. And right now, Utah has the highest per capita use of water in the entire United States. We have the very lowest water bills, and we're planning all of these developments along inputs into Great Salt Lake based on projections of water that we're using now. And, our world is changing. We need to take care of those issues we're going to deplete our water resources, and we've seen it in Farmington this year.
Yeah.
In Farmington there was people purposefully kept their water on despite call for reducing watering of lawns. And so, I mean, that's something that we really need to tackle. I think we also really need to tackle some of these issues with water laws.
Yeah.
So our water laws were created before Utah was even a state. And so they don't reflect the changes that have happened over the past 100 or 150 years.
Yeah.
And it doesn't allow, I mean, they literally do not allow for conservation of water.
Yeah. If there was one final message that you were to give people watching this, or the Salt Lake Institute were to give to people watching this, what would that be?
Great Salt Lake is weird. You know, it's salty and it's smelly, and, you know, things are pickled along the shoreline after they die, and it doesn't meet everybody's expectations. We have this expectation of lake houses and, you know, boat houses and like lots of development and boardwalks, and that's not how Great Salt Lake is. But it doesn't diminish how greatly it affects both our economy and our health and our human ecosystems, and it's super important. And so while we don't always see all of the things that the lake provides for us, it's there. And if we lose it, we don't get it back. They didn't recreate Owens Lake and fill it back up with water. They fixed it by putting rocks on the bottom of the lake. So I would say we all need to be very aware of how much it impacts us and how much we impact Great Salt Lake.
Yeah, I guess I'll make a final question.
Okay.
Is there a real fear that we might lose Salt Lake, the Great Salt Lake, entirely?
Yeah, and I mean, so already the lake is cut in half by the railroad causeway. There was a rock-filled causeway that was put in the middle of the lake to decrease transportation routes, and it splits the lake into two. So there's the north arm and the south arm. The south arm is what most people see, and that's about 15% salinity. So compared to the ocean, that's 3.5%. It's about 5 times saltier than the ocean, but that's where brine shrimp flourish. That's where a lot of the birds are being produced, and you know, especially those eastern perimeter of Great Salt Lake, where all of the ducks and the duck hunting happens. You know, those are all very important. But I have heard people talk about cutting off the north arm entirely to save half of Great Salt Lake, which is still, I mean, it's still a pretty like enormous swath of land. That I hope that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
I mean, one of our research projects is on American white pelicans, and they nest in the middle of the north arm of Great Salt Lake. And it seems counterintuitive because pelicans eat fish, and fish don't live in hypersaline water.
Yeah.
And what they're doing is they're trading food and fresh water for a safe place to nest. And I mean, it's the second largest breeding population of American white pelicans in the world that lives on Gunnison Island. And part of their protection is like that railroad causeway and the remoteness and the inaccessibility of that island to both predators and people. And so that's just, you know, that's one example of what we would lose up there.
Yeah. All right, I think that covers everything I wanted
Awesome.
to cover. Thank you so much
Totally.
again.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I wanted to take down some of my thoughts real quick after watching this for the first time. And also I wanted to talk a bit about what we discussed after the recording was finished. I actually thought there was more insightful stuff that I gleaned after the recording was over. And that was that Jaimi expressed some concern, kind of in an optimistic way, but it was a legitimate concern, and that was for the future of the lake. And I think that what bothers her, what she was concerned about, is that Utahns and people on average don't think about the ecology and the environment that we live in. We kind of take those things for granted. And she knew that the older generations, the ones who were around before the internet, before a lot of the niceties that keep us indoors all the time, like they get the value of the Great Salt Lake and of Utah Lake. and of the wilderness just in general. And she was hopeful that somehow we could get the younger generations involved with the Utah Lake, showing interest to what that lake means for the bird populations, what it means for the environment, and taking an interest in raising policies that really do help protect these things. And that's the main reason that I chose these subject to discuss, because I kind of am a little self-aware of my disconnect from the environment and from the world around me. Like, I do take those things for granted. I hope that after watching my actual video once it comes out, that you're able to see and appreciate what we take for granted just a little bit more. And I don't expect this to be any major YouTube thing, but I just wanted to put my ideas down, at least record them for audio to tack on to the end of the video. And yeah, it gave me a lot to think about, and hopefully there will be some way to revive a future in Utah where there is a group of people who value and protect the lands that we take for granted currently. And thank you guys for listening and watching this. I appreciate you taking the time to do so. And hopefully you'll tune in for the actual the project itself once it's complete. Thanks.